What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Oh my God, Rob Core, let me tell you something. For years, you could not get me to read a Moon Knight comic. Like, I was 15 or 16 years old when I picked up my first Moon Knight comic, and I read through it, and I was like, this is basically Marvel's Batman. And I closed that comic, and I was like, I'm done. If I'm gonna read Batman, I'm gonna read Batman. I'm not gonna read some ripoff of Batman. And it stayed that way for like years and years and years and years. If anybody walked up to me and said, hey, what do you think about Moon Knight? I would be like, he's Marvel's Batman, and his stories are not that great. And whenever he popped up in a story, I would be like, man, Moon Knight sucks. Like, I don't even know why he's here. Man, let me tell you something, like, his stories are good. Like at least Jeff Lemire's story is super good. Like, and it's kind of funny because you guys have been like the Rob Core, you guys have been hounding me saying, Rob, you've got to cover all different Moon Knight. You got to cover all different Moon Knight. And I was just kind of like, whatever, I'll get around to it at some point or another. But I figured, I mean, a lot of the good stuff that I want to cover, I'm kind of waiting on. Like Clone Conspiracy, I'm waiting on. Guardians of the Galaxy, I'm waiting on for the release of the movie. I'm waiting on a lot of those different things to cover, with all different Marvel. And so I kind of figured, well, let's just go ahead and do Moon Knight, or at least I'll read it, and then I'll see whether or not it's a video or it's a comic that I want to cover. Man, do I want to cover this. Okay, so Jeff Lemire, Jason Aaron, Brian Michael Bendis sometimes, these guys have the Midas touch. They touch something and it turns to gold. Like, it's absolutely insane. Bendis especially when he cares about a character that he's writing. But the way that Jeff Lemire does Moon Knight here is so cool because this is really like an introduction to his character in a lot of different ways. There are a couple things that we kind of need to know, but we'll get through those, as we go through it. But for the person who's just now wanting to pick up Moon Knight, all different Moon Knight is a great place to start. So what we do here is we basically pick up with Mark Spector sitting in front of a tomb and just kind of talking to some enigmatic voice. Now, the reason why this matters is because this is the same tomb where Mark Spector first gained his abilities. And what had happened was way back, when his origin story was being told, there were a handful of people that'll actually appear in this that we need to know about. The first one is a guy named Frenchie. During Mark Spector's time, really, once he had joined the military, or I guess part of the Marines, once he had joined the CIA, following all his experience in combat, he basically became a soldier of fortune. He was a mercenary. He was just going around fulfilling contracts and racking up a fortune while he was doing it. Well, there came a point when he was pulled onto a contract basically out in Egypt, and it eventually led to him, engaging in combat with a guy and being mortally wounded. During this time, he'd also formed an alliance with a guy named Frenchie, and their relationship went back quite a bit in terms of them being friends, so on and so forth. But Frenchie DeChamp, I think is how you pronounce it, the two of them were kind of like this 1-2 punch, where they were a team group that always worked together. During this whole confrontation, there was also the introduction of a girl named Marlene. And what had happened was that when Mark Spector was mortally wounded, that he was brought before the statue of a god named Khonshu in Egypt. And basically in the twilight of his life, in the final moments of his life, Khonshu basically said, I will keep you alive. I will grant you a second chance if you accept the role as basically my avatar on Earth. Mark Spector accepted the job. And because of that, he went forward with, different abilities and so on, these really like the influence of Khonshu himself, but he was designed to operate as an agent. And so following that origin story, Mark Spector, Frenchie, and Marlene basically took off to the United States, and that's when he began operating as Moon Knight. But the reason why this matters is because this is essentially the temple that he was brought before. Now, the funny thing about this is that the more that he talks, I mean, it's this idea that Khonshu is saying, hey, you're dying, I'm here to keep you alive, just come a little further. And it's really Jeff Lemire kind of reinventing, reworking on this whole thing about the concept of Moon Knight. It's really kind of like this shorthand retelling of his origin story, in the sense that he comes in direct contact with Khonshu. Khonshu says, you're going to act as my agent, but the whole basis behind this is that Mark Spector is essentially rediscovering himself. Something happened somewhere along the line that Mark Spector forgot everything he was. Now, here's the cool thing, is we get this awesome, and by the way, the art in this story is amazing. I mean, it looks like it's just like chalk art, but the art's amazing. But we get this full page spread where we have a cab driver, we have a guy who looks like he's super rich, with Marlene, and then of course we have Moon Knight himself. Now, the way this plays out is the cab driver is a guy named Jake Lockley, and the rich guy is a dude named Steve Grant. These are the personalities of Mark Spector. Now, the way things played out with regards to his character in the original Moon Knight line of stories, and even going forward with regards to the different iterations, the multiple reboots, and an attempt to reinvigorate interest in his character, the way this played out was that having multiple lives, that is to say, using the cab driver, Jake Lockley, as a way to gain information he wouldn't normally be able to gain on his own, using the identity of Steve Grant as a way to be able to fund his extravagant lifestyle put a lot of mental stress on him, and essentially it drove Mark Spector insane to the point that he developed multiple personality disorder. And there were times where he didn't know if he was really Steve Grant, if he was really Jake Lockley, or if he was really Mark Spector. He didn't know which personality he was. And that's what made the comic so interesting, is because a lot of people would look at him and say, well, he's basically Marvel's Batman. Well, to a degree. I mean, they operate at night. They both have these little, little batarang type things that they both throw. They both thrive on fear of people, people being afraid of them. But Mark Spector has the added bonus of having a psychological effect to his comics where you don't know as you're going through if maybe he's crazy or maybe he's sane. It's really what drives the force behind his comics, because it injects a whole new persona. And what Jeff Lemire does is he thrives on this. He literally just seizes on this element of insanity, and we as the reader don't know if Mark Spector is insane or if he's a rational, sane human being. Now, what happens is, we basically kind of jerk back to the present day, and he's essentially in a mental institution. Now, two guys that are here, and they're going to kind of be background characters, for a lot of this, two guys named Bobby and Billy, and they're basically orderlies who are just dicks. I mean, they're just, beating him up all the time, giving him a hard time. The people that essentially abuse their power, but of course they sedate him because in their mind, he's acting insane, he's acting crazy, and then they subject him to electric shock therapy. But in the midst of all this, in the background of all this, is always Khonshu talking to him, whispering to him. Now, at this point, we basically pick up with him inside the main ward itself, and we run into a woman named Gina. Now, Gina in the Moon Knight comics before All New, All Different Marvel was essentially a contact. She ran a diner. She had two sons named Ray, and I can't remember the name of the other son, but they were basically ones that would help him gain information about what was going on. It was not unlike Mark Spector going in there and saying, hey, what have you guys heard going on with this diner? What have you guys heard, from people coming in, talking, whispering, that kind of thing? It was a way for him to gain a better understanding of what was happening. This was really his Jake Lockley persona preying on this. It wasn't like Mark Spector would go in there, the Jake Lockley persona would go in there. And so because of that, this is really Mark Spector saying, hey, I mean, maybe he is insane. This really comes to hit home when there's a news broadcast that he's watching saying Moon Knight was spotted in New York and fought against someone named Glass Scarlet. And so again, it's like, man, like maybe this really is all in his head. Maybe Mark Spector was never Moon Knight. Maybe this entire time he's just been in a mental institution, essentially going insane. And that's what makes things so interesting. Now, at this point, we pick up with a guy named Mark Crawley. Now, as far as I could tell, Mark Crawley, I mean, he goes back to Marvel Premiere, but he was just an old school character that would pop up from time to time. I want to say he was an information broker to a degree, but I don't think he had a really significant role. People who are more knowledgeable about Moon Knight will probably be able to shed some light on this. So if you know about him, feel free to post down in the comments. But the idea here is that Crawley's essentially saying, hey, look, what you believe and what's actually happening right now are two distinctly different things. What you're seeing right now may or may not be true. The hallucinations that you're having with regards to Khonshu may or may not be true. And so it's really kind of Jeff Lemire messing with us, saying, well, maybe Crawley's there, maybe he's not there, maybe he's insane, maybe he's sane. Again, Jeff Lemire really keeps things ambiguous, keeps things really mysterious, and it's one of the reasons why I love this story so much. But from here, we basically have Mark Spector being taken to his treatment sessions by Billy and Bobby, and he passes Marlene. And that's what Jeff Lemire does with this. It's essentially all the major players from Mark Spector's life as Moon Knight prior to All New, All Different Marvel who were housed in this mental institution. And so really what Jeff Lemire is saying is, was Mark Spector really Moon Knight? Was Marlene really his lover? Was he really in contact with Gina, who was an information broker for him? Or were they all just members of an insane asylum and Mark Spector's just been imagining it by just putting faces and names, to substitute his insanity? And so what happens here is we basically pick up with a woman by the name of Dr. Emmett. And Dr. Emmett is, again, this woman that's basically saying, hey, look, none of what you're talking about is true. You were never Moon Knight. You're Mark Spector. You've been here since you were 12 years old. The Moon Knight persona was something that you made up. And what she does is she pulls out this book. And this book is just all these different drawings that Mark Spector's made where he's drawn out Moon Knight and he's talked about Khonshu and he's written all this stuff out. And so again, it's like the plot thickens. Like, every ounce, every step we take is deeper down the rabbit hole. It is maybe he's legitimately crazy. Maybe he's just absolutely insane. Maybe he's off his rocker. But this starts to come to a head back in his cell that night. And he keeps talking to Khonshu and he's asking Khonshu, can you hear me? And Khonshu says, yes, of course I can hear you. And it's basically them saying, it's time for you to act. It's time for you to rise. It's time for Moon Knight to be born again. And so what happens is Mark Spector basically creates this half-cocked Moon Knight costume using a sheet as a cape, and then basically using his pillowcase to wrap it around his head. He drew the moon symbol, the moon insignia on the sheet itself and is declaring himself as Moon Knight. And so it's like, this is so cool because it's like, maybe he's just crazy. Maybe that's it. Maybe it's just that he's insane. Dude, I'm fanboying out right now because this story was so good. Of course, he attacks Billy and Bobby, takes off to the rooftop, and when he gets there, the entire city of New York is basically like this giant Egyptian landscape. You have a huge pyramid off in the distance, you got sand everywhere. I mean, you have all these different elements of Egyptian culture just gravitating around New York. And so the idea is, okay, we're supposed to believe right now that New York is immersed in sand, that there's a giant pyramid off in the distance, that everything has come crashing down. And so because of that, Moon Knight kind of looks around and he's like, oh my God, and of course Khonshu is basically saying, hey, look, this is what happened. My brother Seth has invaded your realm, invaded your reality basically, and is launching an attack or launching a full-scale invasion against New York. And the more we go through this, the more ridiculous it seems. Like, the more insane it seems. And the reason why I say this is because once Bobby, Billy, and a couple other orderlies catch up to Mark Spector, they inject him with a sedative, and they basically say, see, there's nothing there. And when he looks out onto the landscape, all that Egyptian stuff is gone. Every last bit of it is gone. There's nothing there. It's just New York, the way it's always been. The skyline, the way it's always been. And it's just so incredibly done, because it's just like, Jesus, like, man, maybe this is really the case. Now, again, from here, we pick up with yet another meeting of Mark Spector alongside Dr. Emmett. And this is really when it seems like he's fully given in. Where previously the meeting was like, well, maybe you're right, Dr. Emmett. Maybe I am insane. Maybe I'm imagining all these personalities. Maybe I was never Moon Knight. Where that was the first meeting. Now he's like, no, I am Moon Knight. I am the fist of Khonshu. I am the wrath of the Egyptian god Khonshu, and I'm here to carry out his will on the planet Earth. Now, of course, again, Dr. Emmett's like, okay, from her perspective, the way that Jeff Lemire writes it, it's like she's a woman that's been working with Mark Spector ever since he was 12 years old. She's been with him all this time, and because of that, she basically says, look, I thought we were making progress. I thought you were getting better. I thought you were improving here. It's almost as if she's like at her wit's end. Like we would expect. I mean, if you had a mental patient who had multiple personality disorder, and it seemed like they were getting past this, where they were starting to realize who they were, and then suddenly they revert back and say, no, I am this one personality that I made up. Well, then suddenly you just kind of feel like you're exhausted. You feel like you're mentally exhausted. Like, I thought we were making progress. You've basically just relapsed. And so what happens is, as he's being led away, he refers to her as somebody named Amu, which is basically an evil Egyptian deity. And so what Jeff Lemire is saying is that if Mark Spector's not insane, if Mark Spector's not crazy, then that's not really Dr. Emmett. That's somebody else taking her place. But you guys see the beauty of this, right? Like, everything he's spouting seems to be absolute nonsense. I mean, let's look at this from the Doctor's perspective. For example, as we keep going through this story, let's look at this from the Doctor's perspective. For example, we have Frenchie. We have Frenchie Duchamp there. Again, a longtime friend of Mark Spector. Let's say that Mark Spector really did make this up. I mean, as he's going through this electric shock treatment, let's say that he really is just making all this up. That at this moment right now, he's not actually meeting with Khonshu. During this mental treatment, he's not actually meeting with him. Let's say that he has been in this mental institution since he was 12 years old. And let's say that he knew the names of a handful of people who were there. Maybe it's because he heard the orderlies talking to them. Maybe it's because he'd asked about them when he was talking to Dr. Emmett and forgot, whatever the case may be. But let's say that Mark Spector has never been Moon Knight. That maybe he saw a newsreel about a superhero named Moon Knight and he imagined himself in that role. And then he fabricated the entirety of his past life. Frenchie, the origin of his powers, the introduction and him falling in love with Marlene, creating the persona of Jake Lockley, creating the persona of Steve Grant. Let's say that none of that is real. He's just a crazy guy and it's all in his imagination. The beauty of this story is that is entirely possible. That is entirely possible. That throughout the entire history of Marvel Comics, there has never been a Moon Knight. It's never played out that way. Now, the cool thing about this, though, is that as he's talking to Khonshu in this dream sequence that he's having, this is Jeff Lemire kind of reminding us about what's going on, saying, hey, look, in the Marvel multiverse, so to speak, or really just in the main Marvel universe, you have pocket dimensions. You have these small little dimensions here and there. Asgard is a pocket dimension, and well, the Negative Zone's not really a pocket dimension, but this place called the Overvoid, this is basically a pocket dimension. And what Khonshu says is, we are not actually Egyptian gods. Instead, we're basically elder gods. We'd been around long before the Egyptians, but it was easy and it was beneficial for us to manipulate, the various human species from around the earth, especially in the early days before technology ran amok. Because, one of the cool things that Jeff Lemire says is that there's a direct correlation between the drop in miracles and the rise of technology. It's very hard to say this is a miracle when somebody can videotape it and it can be verified that it's not a miracle. And so because of that, the influence of Khonshu, the influence of these gods on modern day society had more or less begun to disappear. And the reason why Mark Spector was chosen to be the avatar of Khonshu is because Mark Spector has a weak mind, because Mark Spector is not strong in spirit. His only real goal was to just acquire massive amounts of wealth. That's really it. But he was a person that could easily be taken advantage of because his mind was essentially already on the way to being fractured because of his past experiences, murder and so on and so forth. And so because of that, Khonshu says people will work against you, that they're, that his brother, Khonshu's brother Seth, in the invasion that he has sent out a lot of his own his own avatars, in the sense that, if Dr. Emmett's not actually Dr. Emmett, that she's working for Seth, that Khonshu says you have a lot of allies here, they will help you along the way. So, Crawley is an ally, Frenchie's an ally, Marlene is an ally. You guys see how this is really feeding on this insanity. It's almost like a self-fulfilling thing. Mark Spector's like, I believe I'm Moon Knight, and so I'm going to look for information or fabricate information to verify that I'm Moon Knight. That's why it makes it so cool. And so once he snaps back to reality, once he jumps back to the moment, again, he's talking to Crawley, and Crawley's like, hey man, look, maybe you're insane, maybe you're not insane, but regardless of what the situation is, we have orchestrated an escape. We've orchestrated a way to get out of here. Now, this is where Jeff Lemire kind of starts to blend things in a really funny way. And the reason why is because the more you go on, the more you're like, okay, maybe Mark Spector maybe he's not insane. But then in the back of your mind, you're like, maybe he is. Maybe these guys are just nuts. Maybe they're just crazy people. And it's just a bunch of crazy guys trying to get out of a mental institution because they have all kinds of strange issues going on. And so because of that, when they make their escape, when they start breaking out, the initial idea is to just get Mark Spector alongside Frenchie and Crawley for the three of them to make their escape. But Mark says, no, there are other people that we need. We need Marlene. We need Gina. Because remember, Mark Spector is building on these memories, or he's grabbing these memories of Gina being a contact on the street level, Marlene being his girlfriend. And so for him, he can't just leave them behind. But then we also get, God, it's so awesome the way this is drawn. We also get him putting on his Moon Knight costume, where he's got the white suit. And I feel like people are going to wear the hell out of this at some, comic book conventions and stuff like that. But it looks absolutely incredible. But they essentially make their escape. And this is where things get crazy, because Jeff Lemire is like, maybe he's not crazy. Maybe he's totally sane. And the reason why is because once they make their escape and they start heading down the stairs, the walls begin to start showing hieroglyphics that there's secret exits to get away into a subway system. That once they get down to the subway system, they're all immersed by mummies. Now, we could just chalk this up and say, well, Mark Spector's just crazy. He's imagining these mummies, but he's not the only one. Frenchie sees the mummies. Crawley sees the mummies. And so maybe it's like, wow, Seth really is launching an invasion. Now from here, in the middle of them trying to escape, we're met with the arrival of Dr. Emmett as a woman who basically looks like a giant alligator. And so her, along with Bobby and Billy, appear like these representatives of Seth. And so it's like, okay, well, maybe he is sane. Maybe he is completely sane. And this, this elder god Seth is launching an invasion against the planet Earth and is doing it behind the scenes. You're really casting these illusions so no one actually knows that it's happening. And then suddenly they'll wake up one day and New York as they know it will be completely gone. And so what happens is Moon Knight basically tells Crawley, he tells Frenchie, he tells everybody, get out of here. Marlene's still unconscious from her treatments. Get her out of here. Get Gina out of here. Run. I'll catch up to you. Because Moon Knight will be able to hold his own against all these guys. At least we would expect him to. But in the midst of all this, he's hit with an injection where it seems like he's kind of snapped back to reality. And when he does, it's just a regular subway system. It's just a regular subway with regular, walls, and there's no sand here. There's no mummies anywhere or anything like that. Dr. Emmett looks just as normal as she always did. Billy and Bobby look just as normal as they always did. And so it's like, how do you reconcile this? Is what we're seeing right now in terms of the normal world, is that the hallucination and the whole, Egypt taking over New York, is that what's really happening? It's a great way to kind of spin this story. But what happens is Dr. Emmett says, look, we're going to bring you back in. We're going to get you the treatment that you need. And I promise you'll be amazed. You won't believe what we accomplished. And he says, no, I won't. Because remember, he's still convinced that she's Amu, and in response, he basically hits her with an injection and runs for the hills. Now from here, he runs into the subway tunnel and it's just complete and total darkness. He can't find Crawley. He can't find Frenchie. He can't find Marlene. He can't find Gina. He can't find anybody that he knows. And then suddenly he's hit with the arrival of Khonshu again. And Khonshu, this is really kind of cool here because Khonshu is basically saying, hey, look, the reason why you're starting to see normal things whenever you're hit with these injections is because you're anchoring yourself to normalcy. You want to believe that that's the norm. You want to believe that you're not crazy. You want to believe that you're not mad. But what he says is, be mad. Be insane. Let your insanity guide you. Now, again, this is really kind of crazy because, it almost seems like Khonshu is a figment of Mark Spector's imagination and is trying to pull him further down the rabbit hole, just trying to pull him further down that rabbit hole to the point that he just starts getting crazier and crazier and he loses all sense of self. You can almost imagine this entire scenario that he's experiencing right now being nonsense, that he's just laying in a bed somewhere and then he'll just wake up and everything will be normal. Not only that, as he makes his way through the subway system, he finally reaches what appears to be an end, and he's basically in an Egyptian temple. He's in an Egyptian pyramid with 2 different roads that he can take. And so again, because of his madness, because you have Dr. Emmett and you have Billy and Bobby chasing after him, Moon Knight basically relies on his madness. He says, what does my insanity say I should do? And he ends up taking the left, and of course he runs into Gina and he runs into everybody. But then suddenly they end up with this wall that looks like it just kind of extends out into the void of nowhere, out into space. Well, then they're met by the arrival of Anubis. Now, historically speaking, Anubis has played a lot of different roles in the realm of Egyptian culture, and it really depends on what we're talking about. For example, in the first dynasty up until about 2,900 years, I want to say it was around 2,900 years before Christ, he was kind of like this embalmer. He was this guy that basically represented what it meant to die, represented the concept of the afterlife. Now, following, 2,900 BC, going into the next dynasty of the pharaoh, really the pharaoh rule, he was replaced by Osiris. But historically speaking, Anubis has almost always been associated with, as an Egyptian god that ferried the souls of the dead to the afterlife. Very similar to Greek mythology, where people were ferried, where the ferryman would bring the souls of the dead to the underworld. What happens here is Anubis says, I can take you guys wherever you need to go. And so Jeff Lemire is kind of transforming Anubis from the ferryman of souls to the afterlife to just this interdimensional ferryman where he'll take you wherever it is that you want to go. But he says he requires a soul. He requires someone to sacrifice their soul. It's the price that must be paid. And so because of this, Crawley basically says, okay, fine, you can have my soul, because he's basically done with all his living. That's what he says. He says, look, I'm almost done with all my living. So you can take my soul as long as he gets my friends to safety. Now, it doesn't mean that he dies right off the bat. Instead, what happens is they're basically taken from what appears to be out in the overvoid or out in this interdimensional space, and they're basically brought back to Earth. But in the midst of all this, when Mark Spector, when Gina, when Marlene and Frenchie are all leaving, that Crawley stays behind and says, this is not my stop. My stop is the afterlife. I agreed that I would pay my soul, and so my soul is what's going to be paid. And so in the end, he basically stays behind. Now, this is kind of a crushing moment for Mark Spector, just because of the fact that, again, as far as I know, they didn't have a great big huge involvement, but Crawley did play a role in Mark Spector's life. And so it's almost like leaving a piece of himself behind. Not only that, what Jeff Lemire is going to do is he's going to follow this pattern. It's always going to be the team begins, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's kind of his way, it's kind of Jeff Lemire's way of going back and setting everything back to zero and giving us a new place to start off from, which it actually works beautifully well. But, once they arrive in New York City proper and they basically, walk out onto the surface, the illusion that Mark Spector had earlier of a giant, pyramid in the middle of the city, that everything was covered in sand, that's true. And in fact, he asked Frenchie, he says, are you seeing this? Are you seeing the sand? He asked Gina, are you seeing the sand? And they say, yes, I'm seeing everything you're seeing. So this is when Jeff Lemire essentially walks away from the idea, or at least it seems like he's walking away from the idea of Mark Spector being genuinely insane. And instead, it seems like he's very much sane. And what Khonshu's been telling him is the truth, that the god Seth had launched an attack against the planet Earth, that none of the superheroes know about it. No one can ever really see it because it's kind of like this backdrop, it's like this veil that's hidden from the eyes of normal people. And so because of that is, kind of Mark Spector's position is really his role as the avatar of Khonshu to write this, to basically find Seth, defeat him, and restore everything back to normal, send Seth back to where he's supposed to be. And so, and what happens is we basically pick up with a cop, because again, they don't see anybody around here. They're like, where's everybody at? Where's everyone at here? Like basically every single person that would normally be here, the busy streets, the whole 9 yards, it's all gone. It's like they're the only ones in the city. From this cop's perspective, they're just in the middle of a hurricane. Now, what a hurricane is doing out in New York, we don't really know. As far as I know, there's only been like 1 or 2 hurricanes that have ever hit New York. The one being most recently, Hurricane Sandy. But that was about it. Now, again, this is Jeff Lemire messing with us, because we would look at this and say, okay, if this did not take place at the same time as a real hurricane, then there's nothing to anchor us to the belief that there is actually a hurricane going on. Instead, if there's a hurricane, a tsunami, what have you, then it's just like, okay, then it's just absolute insanity going on here. Maybe Mark Spector really is just crazy. The funny thing about this is that Mark Spector reacts exactly the way that we would think he would when the cop's like, you guys need to come with me, and he's just like, nope, and just punches the hell out of the cop. Not only that, it's almost like the Scooby-Doo moment, where he pulls the mask off, and it's basically a servant of Seth. Now, I'll be honest, I think a hilarious moment, I imagine Moon Knight fans will get all bent out of shape over this, but a hilarious moment, is if he had been like, a servant of Seth, you know, and the servant was like, and I would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids. But it was just kind of a cool thing. But this is why the Moon Knight stories are so cool. God, I really wish I'd gotten into Moon Knight sooner. This is why it's so cool, is because, you know, this guy attacks Frenchie, you know, of course, bites his neck, more or less mortally wounds him, or it seems like it mortally wounds him, you know, and in the end it does. You know, it's basically him saying, I see what's going on. I see what's happening. Of course, he dies and goes to the afterlife. But again, you know, this is so beautifully done, because it's like the numbers just keep thinning out. The number of people just keep getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Jeff Lemire is removing them and basically kind of like starting over. Now, I haven't read the second volume yet, so it may be that all those different characters come back. But again, we basically pick up with Gina's Diner, because of course, as Jake Lockley, Mark Spector constantly went in here, you know, as his Jake Lockley persona, to communicate with Gina, to basically say, hey, what have you heard? You know, have you heard anything weird? You heard anything crazy? You know, the other funny thing about this, and this is why I love Jeff Lemire's writing, because he injects some great humor. Gina says, hey, look, after everything we've been through, what we need is some coffee and some breakfast. And man, that is true. I start my morning off with coffee every day. If I didn't, woe betide the poor soul that runs up on me. But Mark Spector leaves to go to the bathroom, and Khonshu makes an appearance. And this is hilarious. Khonshu says, the end is here, you know, and you're wasting time eating pancakes. Now, let's be honest with ourselves, Rob Core. There's always time for pancakes. You can always make time for pancakes. There's never a time when it's not okay to eat pancakes. It's an anytime meal. You know, morning, you know, for breakfast, lunch, you can have pancakes for dinner. I've done it before. I might even do it tonight. But, you know, it's really cool, because Marlene suddenly comes to. And Marlene, you know, she seems to be the one that's anchored most to what's going on, to this reality of the situation, you know, where she tells Mark, we have to go. We have to get out of here. We have to go defeat Seth. Now remember, Jeff Lemire is leaving things really ambiguous with Marlene. You know, I mean, he's leaving things really, really open-ended, in the sense that we don't really know how in touch with reality she is. You know, again, this may all be an illusion in the mind of Mark Spector's head, you know, because again, if these are all constructs that he's made up, then of course Gina would see what he sees, because he wants her to see that, because he's making her up as he goes. And so again, you know, what happens is Gina basically stays behind. She says, no, I'm gonna stay here. And instead, Marlene and Mark Spector head off to the temple of Seth. Now, once they get there, they're immediately attacked by Moon Knight. You know, and the cool thing about this is that Marlene basically says, yeah, I know I remember everything. I remember everything about our past life. I remember everything about when we first met. I remember how you became Moon Knight. I remember us falling in love, coming to America, and the two of us being this sort of duo where I was your emotional support and you were a superhero. I helped to anchor you to reality. But with the arrival of Moon Knight attacking them, it actually works out beautifully, because again, it's this question of, is this all an illusion? If that's not Moon Knight, then who is it? And if it is Moon Knight, then who the hell is Mark Spector? And so it comes out so well. Now, of course, with the fight between the two of them, Mark Spector easily comes out on top here. I mean, it's really rage, anger that guides him, but following the path, the bloody path of Moon Knight, he walks through a door and he ends up on the moon in an astronaut suit. And it's like, okay, this is beginning to turn into a descent into madness. And this is why I say that Jeff Lemire does a really good job, because once he walks through the door on the moon, he's attacked by all these crazy monsters. He runs back through the door again. Suddenly he's on a movie set and he's Steve Grant, you know, and it's like, okay, Marlene's dressed up in a costume. They're acting out a movie role, you know, and then we have the orderlies coming after him again. Then he goes through the door and now he's Jake Lockley and he's a cab driver. I mean, it's like, what in the hell is going on with this story? It's absolutely insane. But as he passes through these doors, what Jeff Lemire is basically doing is it's Moon Knight, it's Mark Spector coming to terms with his own identities, coming to terms with his own personalities, reconciling the fact that each personality had something to offer, and each personality is just as real as the next because they all served a purpose. The Jake Lockley personality is just as real as the Mark Spector and Steve Grant personalities, because Jake Lockley was a name and identity that Mark Spector created to understand what was going on the streets when, you know, he wouldn't normally be able to gain that information. The Steve Grant persona was just as viable and just as logical and real as the Jake Lockley and Mark Spector persona, because it allowed him to basically say, here's how I'm able to live this extravagant life. Here's how I'm able to live this high life. You know, here's how I'm able to find out what people are doing on the corporate level when it comes to bringing down these various criminals and so on and so forth. And so again, it's really kind of Jeff Lemire saying each of these characters, here's what they stand for, here's what they're about. Each of them are important, presumably because we'll see those characters return later on down the line during his run on Moon Knight. But walking through this final door, he comes upon Seth. And this is where Jeff Lemire kind of drops all the pieces, reveals the whole picture. And what he basically says here is that Khonshu had deceived Mark Spector. That Khonshu had brought Mark Spector in and said, you know, look at this, Seth is trying to lay an invasion, Seth is trying to take everything over. When in reality, Khonshu had set all this up. And the reason why is because Khonshu's body, his physical body, was basically dying. And what he needed was a host to basically reside in the sense that Khonshu wants to take over the body of Mark Spector, eliminate all of his identities, and he would just be Khonshu walking around in the body of Mark Spector from now until however long. But in the end, Mark Spector turns it down. Mark Spector says, no, sure, I'm supposed to be your avatar, but I'm not letting you take my physical body. I would rather die. And that's what he does. He jumps out from the ledge on a pyramid, he hits the ground and dies. I mean, it's just, you know, spatter everywhere. And then he wakes up as Steve Grant. And it's like, what the hell is going on? Was this all just a dream in the mind of Mark Spector? Was it all just a dream? I mean, is Mark Spector a made-up personality? Has it been Steve Grant the entire time? Because that's why this works. That's why this works so well. I mean, imagine, for example, that you're a wealthy businessman. All right, like imagine that you're a millionaire and imagine that you've done it all. You've hung out with the Avengers, or maybe you just hung out with like the rich members of the Avengers. Like you've had dinners with Tony Stark. You've traveled the world. You've had beautiful women on your arms. You've driven fabulous cars. You've done it all. There's nothing left that interests you. Well, then suddenly, let's say that you just fabricate a personality. You make up a guy named, you know, Mark Spector. And Mark Spector, much like all the other superheroes in the Marvel landscape, gained his powers through mysterious, intriguing, and fabulous means. You know, and his power came from an Egyptian god that he made up named Khonshu. And as the agent of Khonshu, Steve Grant just runs out into the night, beating up various criminals and things like that. It's an escape from a life that has become mundane. That's why that works, because Jeff Lemire is like, that's entirely possible. That it was always Steve Grant. It was never Mark Spector who made up the Steve Grant personality. It was Steve Grant who made up the Mark Spector, Jake Lockley personalities. It's a mind-bending story. It's insane. But if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. This was one hell of a story. I love Jeff Lemire's writing. It's so good. Fanboy, I'm fanboying out here. But if you guys like this video, make sure you drop a like and leave a comment down below, because I'm curious, what did you guys think of this story? I loved it. But let me know down in the comments, what did you guys think of this story? And I will catch you all later. Peace.